Dr. Sandler is a senior scholar at the Women's Research and Education Institute in Washington, D.C., where she consults with institutions and others about achieving equity for women, and is a former Adjunct Associate Professor at Drexel University College of Medicine. She formerly wrote a quarterly newsletter about women on campus. She has given over 2,500 presentations, has written more than 100 articles, and is well known for expertise in women's educational equity in general, as well as sexual harassment, the chilly classroom climate, and her knowledge of policies, programs, and strategies concerning women on campus. She also serves as an expert witness in discrimination and sexual harassment cases. She previously directed the project on the status and education of women at the Association of American Colleges, where she published more than 100 reports. She has a long list of firsts, such as the first reports on campus sexual harassment, gang rape, campus peer harassment, and the chilly climate for women, including the first reports on how men and women are treated differently in the classroom. She was the first person appointed to a congressional committee staff to work specifically on women's issues, and the first person to testify before a congressional committee about discrimination against women in education. Back in the 1970s, she filed the first charges of sexual discrimination against more than 250 institutions at a time where there were no laws prohibiting sex discrimination in education. She played a major role in the development and the passage of Title IX and other laws prohibiting sex discrimination in education, and has been associated with Title IX longer than any other person. The New York Times has referred to her as the Godmother of Title IX, and that is a nickname that she still holds. She has also consulted on Citadel with their female assimilation plan, and is currently working on a book involving student-to-student harassment from kindergarten to 12th grade, and has served on the Women's Health Initiative Advisory Board of the Bayer Corporation. Please welcome Dr. Sandler to Creighton University.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just delighted to be here. The first time I ever heard of Creighton was about 1970 or 71, and I was looking up the figures for women in medical schools. And the number of women in most medical schools was usually under 10. There were a few that had as many as 14 or 15. But of this whole list of medical colleges in the United States, the one at the bottom of the list was Creighton. Creighton had the smallest number of women medical students. I don't know what the proportion is now, but I'm sure it's close to half the medical students. And I'm delighted to come here and actually see that Creighton has changed since those days. I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about the progress we've made and where we still have to go. And I want to start off by talking about Title IX. Title IX is the most important law that's been passed for women and girls since women got the right to vote, which was back in 1920. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then get into how far we've come and how far we still have to go. So I want to start with going back to the 1960s, which is well before most of you were born, or all of you were born. The women's movement is only a few years old. There's very little awareness of sex discrimination throughout the nation. We don't have the word sexist. We don't have the word sexism. We don't have a word for sexual harassment. The word date rape hasn't been invented yet, so it's a very different time. And even the words sex discrimination are brand new. And you can try to imagine what it's like if you don't have a word for something. If you don't have a word for something, you can't think about it, and you can't see that there are patterns. You think it's your own individual experience. And there's not much interest in women's issues except for a few women, a few small women's groups, a few men of goodwill, and some negative members from the press. Most people who did notice what we would today call sex discrimination often did not even realize it was wrong. It seemed natural. It seemed normal. It seemed the right way to do something. For example, when I applied to college, the application said, girls need higher grades and higher test scores in order to be admitted. And statements like that were not uncommon. Women need to be better qualified in order to be admitted to our school, or we have to be especially well qualified. And nobody complained. Nobody even saw this as wrong. I mean, I remember thinking, I'm just going to have to work harder to get better grades so I can get into that college. But I certainly didn't see it as anything unusual. This is before the web. It's before email. There are no newsletters at all dealing with women's rights, women's issues, discrimination. There are no conferences on women. If anybody invited anyone to come and talk about discrimination, and I was one of the people that began to be invited, some people were very upset. Some people came to heckle, and it would have been a very strange experience to do that back in, say, 1970. Let me give you some examples of what life was like before Title IX. A letter was sent to me by a woman who had applied for a position in one of those nice, small, prestigious colleges in Maine and in New England. And the letter she got was, "Your qualifications are excellent, but we already have a woman in this department." Not an unusual letter, I should tell you, because one was okay, but two would be too many. Another school wrote to another woman that the department did not hire women at all. And indeed, there were many departments that did not hire women, or if they hired women, they openly said, "We hire some women, but we would never give them tenure." It was a very different time. Many undergraduates limited the number of women that they accepted. There was a time period in the early 1960s in the state of Virginia that 21,000 women were rejected for admission to those state colleges and universities. Would you like to guess how many young men were rejected for admission during the same time that the 21,000 women were not admitted? Make a guess, someone. Low. Way too high. Got to come down a lot. How many? 100? Too many. 0. Not one male was rejected, while 21,000 women were rejected. And I've often wondered what happened to them, because for many students, a state college was the only way they could get any kind of education, and none of those women many of those women probably never went to college. And that was just for that 3-year period. Also interesting is nobody got upset by that figure. This was in a report looking at facilities and how many more buildings we need to build in terms of students, and nobody got up and protested and said, "This is awful. These women are not being accepted." It was just seen as okay, and that's the way it was. The School of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University, like medical schools and law schools and engineering schools, had a fixed quota for women students. They would admit 2 women per year, no matter how many applied, no matter how qualified they were. Only 2 would be admitted. I don't know if you followed veterinary medicine, but it's now become a woman's field. I think something like 80% of the vet students are now female. My only daughter could not take a course in auto mechanics when she was learning to drive. She thought that would be an interesting thing to do. And they wouldn't let her take the course because the boys used bad language and apparently had no idea of the language that my daughter and other young girls were using at the time. Yeah, as a child, one of the things I wanted to do, we had a new slide projector in our school. This is the height of new technology at the time. And they were teaching the boys how to run the slide projector. And I wanted to run that slide projector in the worst way. And it was only many years later when I lived up on my own that I actually bought a slide projector and, and later made the connection as to why I needed a slide projector. I also wanted to be a crossing guard, and I couldn't do that. In any event, that was the extent, it was part of the things that happened to boys and girls, very different experiences, but nobody really talked about it or saw anything wrong. Moving right along, in 1969, I got my doctorate at the University of Maryland. I had been teaching there as a part-time lecturer, and there were 7 openings in the department, real big expansion. And they didn't even think of me, and I was like, sorry, can't do that. They didn't even think of me, and I was concerned, so I went to one of my faculty friends, and I said, how come they didn't even consider me for any of those positions? Because I knew I was a good teacher, and evaluations were good and so forth. And he didn't skip a beat, and he said, well, let's face it, you come on too strong for a woman. And I didn't know it at the time, but those 5 words, too strong for women, is when Title IX really begins. I didn't know that it would not only change my life, but also change the lives of millions of women and girls, and boys and men as well, because they would ultimately lead to the passage of Title IX. Instead, I went home and I cried. I blamed myself for speaking up a few times at staff meetings. I said I had spoken too much in my graduate classes. In short, I accepted the assessment that I was too strong for a woman. I have to tell you, however, at that point in life, I was not very strong. Maybe for a woman I was, but I was really very interested in being ladylike. It was one of my ambitions in life, was to be ladylike. I mean, I've got that as one of the things I want to be. But that was what I wanted, and I was seen as just coming on too strong. It was my then husband who helped me understand what was going on. He said, are there any strong men in the department? And I remember myself weeping, saying, yes, they're all strong men. And then he said something. He said, then it's not you, it's sex discrimination. And I was really puzzled by that, and it took me a while to realize that, yes, indeed, it was sex discrimination. And it sort of put me on the road to Title IX. Now, when things go wrong in my life, I start to read about the problem. Now I go to the web. I still read, but it's not the same as reading a book. I'm a great believer in either bibliotherapy or what I now call webotherapy or something. And I began to read about the law and sex discrimination, naively thinking this is immoral and it's wrong, sex discrimination, and therefore it should be illegal. And I was absolutely surprised that all of the great civil rights legislation, all of them exempted for one reason or another, they exempted women and girls in education, students, teachers, faculty, staff. The Equal Pay Act exempted professional women. The Civil Rights Act, which covers race, color, religion, and discrimination based on national origin and sex, had an exemption for educational institutions, and on and on. So that there was no legal protections whatsoever. So because I read a lot, I began, the other thing, the 14th Amendment, which is the great thing in the Constitution, which gives us all equal protection under the law. At that point, it had never been applied to sex discrimination. In other words, the Supreme Court, when presented with what we would call sex discrimination, had always said it did not violate the Constitution whatsoever. So I began reading how African Americans had ended desegregation in schools, in public schools, and how new laws had been enacted. And I found a report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which was looking at the enforcement of civil rights, mostly about African Americans, because in 1970 we didn't know there were Latinos, Hispanics, or whatever we weren't, or Native Americans or any other groups. But it talked about a presidential executive order. I didn't even know what a presidential executive order was, but apparently the president, President Nixon, although the executive order goes back further, the order prohibits federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin. And then there was a little footnote after the word after origin. And I'm an academic. I read footnotes. So I went to the back of the book and found the back of the report, found the footnote, and the footnote said this order had been amended to include sex discrimination. And I immediately made the connection that many colleges, many universities had federal contracts, usually to do research or to produce something for the government, and that therefore, even though there were no laws that prohibited sexual discrimination, the executive order did apply to colleges and universities who had contracts. Now, apparently nobody had made that connection before. I was so stunned with that connection. It was a genuine eureka moment. I was alone in the house, and I literally shrieked aloud. I've never done that before or since. I'm going to shorten the story, but eventually I ended up filing about filing charges against about 250 universities and colleges. I had joined a small group called the Women's Equity Action League, which was started by an attorney in Ohio. I became the chair of the, what was the name of that committee? The Federal Action Contract Compliance Committee. I was the entire committee, but it looked much better when I signed a complaint, chair, federal, et cetera, rather than just saying Bernice Sandler, citizen of the United States. Anyway, nobody had ever filed charges of sex discrimination against universities and colleges. This was a brand new employment issue. And nobody had ever done this before. I didn't really know all of this, as this is looking back and so forth. I had some secret help from the assistant director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, who had been waiting for someone to use this executive order, females to use it. And he was extraordinarily helpful in teaching me political strategies and how to do this. He actually wrote the first complaint, class action complaint against every university and college in the United States that had contracts. We had a lot of strategies to make this work. Within 4 months after the first complaints were filed, in April 1970, the first federal investigations of sex discrimination of American universities began. One at Harvard, very prestigious private, and one at the University of Michigan, very prestigious public institution. I learned just about a year ago that actually in the White House, under President Nixon had to make a decision as to whether the executive order actually covered universities and signed the order. whatever the statement was, that yes, it was covered by the executive order. Essentially, Pandora's box had been opened finally. Now, at the same time this is going on, Representative Edith Green, a Democrat from Portland, Oregon, had former teacher. She's the mother of the Equal Pay Act, which is the first discrimination in employment act passed by the United States Congress. It precedes the Civil Rights Act. And she knows these other laws don't cover women in education, and she wants to introduce something to change that. So she is the mother of Title IX. I'm only the godmother. It's her bill. And so she finally introduces it because she couldn't earlier. She had no data. The government wasn't collecting data about women. She had no data, and she had no constituency, and I provide her with my stuff, so she now has data, and she has a constituency. She not only introduces the bill, she also holds hearings and so forth. I think I've lost my place here. In any event, she holds hearings. The witnesses provide horror stories, mainly about women employed on campus, such as departments refusing to hire women or promote them or give them tenure, paying them less money, etc. There were women who worked full-time for no money because their husbands taught in the department. I knew of a woman with a PhD who was a secretary at Yale University because they would not hire her in the department as her husband, so she took the job as secretary to at least be close to her love of a particular subject. There were many women. In fact, there was one assistant professor, I think it was at Berkeley. Her husband was a full professor. She was an assistant professor. Unlike the other assistant professors, she had no office. She had, I think she was paid the lower salary in the department and so forth. Her husband was in the department, so they wouldn't hire her. But one day she got the Nobel Prize, and they quickly promoted her within days and gave her an office. Women, apparently that was the path you get to being treated better, but most women were not able to do that. Now, whenever legislation is introduced and a hearing is held, you ask the people who are going to be affected, or the organizations that are going to be affected by the bill, and you ask them to testify, because you find out what they will support, what they won't support, and the reasons why. And so you ask people who know this area. They'll also tell you what's wrong with the bill and how it ought to be changed or whatever. The American Council on Education, ACE as it's known, is the big education a big education organization in higher education. They are the ones who monitor the Congress for higher education legislation or legislation that will affect higher education. And they have a paid lobbyist who does nothing but lobby around educational issues. So the staff member, the attorney who's handling the hearings, calls the American Council on Education lawyer and says, would you like to testify? Because we're having this bill which is going to prohibit sex discrimination. And the guy answers, and this is almost verbatim, there is no sex discrimination in higher education, and besides, it's not a problem. This was the biggest break we could have gotten, because it meant he was not monitoring the legislation, which meant higher education was not monitoring the legislation. This is why nobody recognized that athletics was going to be covered, because although none of us thought about athletics initially, when Title IX was introduced, we did, within a few months, recognize that it was going to cover athletics. Although I have to tell you, I remember speaking with a few other women who were working on this issue, and I remember saying, isn't this wonderful, it's going to cover athletics. On field day or play day, and you know what that is, they cancel classes and everybody goes out to the fields and plays, whatever. I said, on field day, there's going to be more games for girls. And this was the impact on athletics that I expected, because I didn't know that much about athletics, and nobody else was watching. This was a stealth bill. If they had been watching, there would have been an exemption for athletics, and there was not. Most of higher education knew nothing about the bill, and the few who did not believe it would have any meaningful impact. The word sports is nowhere in the bill, but the bill is written so it covers everything, unless it's exempted, and there's no exemption for athletic. The hearings are held. Much of what we now know as discrimination was seen as normally reasonable. Of course, universities didn't want to hire women. They'll all get married and quit. Of course, they didn't want to hire married women because they have children and quit. And of course, they would pay married women less because they had a husband. And of course, you would pay single women less because they didn't need as much money. They didn't have a family to support. Most of the testimony dealt with faculty and professional employment because they were the first groups to organize. And we really had no information other than our own experiences with K through 12. We knew vocational guidance was biased. But we had no information. And there were no reports that anybody had written about sex discrimination in K through 12. There were exactly 3 reports on 3 institutions that had been written at the time of the hearings. It was 1,200 pages. Nothing like it had ever been assembled or published, and it was an eye-opener because it was filled with horror stories mainly about professional women, about women of color, and the problems that they also faced in higher education. I was hired to put the hearing record together, and I'm probably the only person who read all 1,200 pages of the testimony. By 1972, you introduce a bill, it doesn't get passed very quickly unless it's a major bill like some of the things the Congress is playing with now. By 1972, Title IX is close to passage, and again, we know it's going to cover athletics, but are not terribly interested in that. A small group of us met with Representative Green, and we said, we're ready to lobby. Representative Green, tell us what you want us to say and what you want us to do. And she looks at us as if we are crazy. She said, I don't want you to do any lobbying on this. And we say, why? She said, because if you start lobbying, people will ask what's in the bill. And if they ask what's in the bill, they'll find out what's in the bill. And if they find out what's in the bill, they're not going to vote for it. And she was absolutely right. There was no lobbying at all for Title IX. So it sort of sneaks through as part of a bigger bill. It's, with this Title IX, I think it went for maybe 12 or 13 titles in the Education Amendments of 1972. And it passes. And the enabling clause, which means there's the bill, this is the major thing, and then there are other exemptions and other parts. But the real heart of Title IX, and I just love to read it aloud, it says, no person shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program receiving federal financial assistance. This parallels Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which says the same thing about people of color and national origin. So they took the wording from that essentially and used it. The words cover everything unless there's a specific exemption. And there are some exemptions. Fraternities and sororities are exempt. Their membership practices are exempt. Single-sex dormitories are exempt, so you can have single-sex dormitories. In 1972, co-ed dormitories was a very radical idea, and a lot of people were very frightened of it, so there was an exemption for that. Certain youth organizations like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and beauty pageants, there's an exemption for beauty pageants. Are you wondering what the beauty pageant exemption is? Let me tell you about the beauty pageant exemption. Some of the presidents of Southern colleges did realize that they have beauty pageants, and the winner of the beauty pageant gets a scholarship. And so they came and said, our young girls need their scholarships, and Title IX is going to take their scholarships away. So there's an exemption for beauty contests. And the people who worded the exemption, which was Mrs. Green's staff and Senator By's staff in the Senate, very carefully crafted this so that the beauty contest has to have, as part of the criteria, some sort of talent. They have to exhibit some sort of talent. So it was worded very, very nicely. So that's how exemptions get in. Some group comes and says, we don't like it, it's going to affect our particular interest. And if you know you're going to lose and you don't want publicity in the bill, you might very well just say, okay, we're stuck with that, because we certainly knew we would not be able to win on some of these issues. In any event, in June 23rd, 1972, a little over 40 years ago, Title IX passed, and President Nixon signs the whole bill as part of a larger bill, signs that into law. There was a one-sentence summary of Title IX in the Washington newspapers, like that, squeezed in between larger summaries of Title VIII and Title X, which were all the other summaries were quite detailed. This one just said it prohibits sex discrimination. Few people realized it was a landmark bill that changed our schools at all levels forever. When a bill becomes law, the federal government has to, particularly a bill like this, the federal government has to develop a regulation to say, how does it affect admissions? How does it affect scholarships that are only for men or only for women? How does it affect admissions? How does it affect marital status, et cetera? So it takes 3 years to write that exemption. And eventually it did get written, and that's known as the Title IX regulation. Most of the time, it was fairly easy to figure out what to do because you use the legal precedents in race discrimination, which essentially say separate but equal is not a good principle. It has to be equal. If you do something for whites, you have to do it for African Americans. And Title IX follows those principles and said, you know, if you're going to have a course on criminal justice, like at the University of Michigan, and you allow only men to take it, either you let women take it on the same basis, or you abolish it altogether. And that works for most everything. Even in athletics, if you buy uniforms for men and women just get one set of uniforms for all the sports that everybody wears, that's not fair. You have to buy uniforms for every team if that's what you're going to do. Or everybody gets to share the uniforms. The men share their uniforms and the women share. So that's fairly easy to do, and regulation was not that difficult really to write, except when you get to sports. Why is this more difficult? Not only because it's big money and everybody's watching and hysterical that they're going to have to provide programs for women, but it becomes important because this is the one place you have to have some sex segregation. And it became very difficult to figure how to do that. How would you know programs, equal opportunities for participation? How would you figure that out? And it was a big crisis because the presidents of many institutions, literally the presidents, made, once the cat was out of the bag, essentially, that people realized sports was going to be covered by Title IX. Collegiate sports was very hysterical. It's big money, it's big power, it's masculine mystique and so forth. So they were trying to lobby. There were 12 separate bills. This is when Title IX became public. 12 separate bills were introduced in the Congress to weaken Title IX's coverage of athletics. And every one of them failed, which is really nice. At that point, we were lobbying. But let me tell you some of the inequities just in sports to give you some idea, again, of where we were when Title IX is just beginning. Early 1970s, the budget for men's varsity sports at the University of Michigan was about $1 million, which was a lot of money then. Okay. The budget for women's varsity athletics was, would anybody like to make a guess? It's a figure you heard before when I asked you to guess. 0. No budget for the women, which means the women have to raise their own money and pay for it themselves when they don't raise enough money for their transportation, for their hotel, for their uniforms, for their equipment, and so forth. And this was fairly common in many places. The women at Michigan, they sold apples on the football games to raise money. At other schools, the women sold trees or had bake sales or whatever. At some schools, male athletes flew first class at the university's expense, while women athletes had to pay for their own transportation, as I just mentioned. Many of the coaches for women were unpaid by volunteers, unlike men coaches who were typically salaried. At the University of Minnesota, there was no budget for women gymnasts, to wrap their wrists or their ankles or whatever. But the male gymnasts were really very gallant. What they did is they saved their used, grungy, sweaty athletic tape and gave it to the women who washed it out and used it. Another example, this one I just learned about recently, a former coach, retired coach of some women's, I've forgotten the sport, one of her athletes had sprained her ankle, and the doctor said, you really, keep ice on it for the next on and off for the next 24 hours. The women had no access to ice, but the men, of course, had an ice machine of some sort. And so she went and asked the male athletic director for some ice for her young athlete who had sprained her ankle. And the coach's response was no. He said, but just tell her to put her foot in the toilet and keep flushing it, and that will work. These are the kinds of things that were considered okay. These were the things that were happening in athletics. And my then office did the first report on discrimination, sex discrimination in collegiate athletics, and we were stunned because these are the kinds of things we were discovering. And it was really pretty bad. New equipment generally went to men's teams, and if they didn't get rid of it, they gave it to the women's teams. Women's facilities such as gyms, locker rooms, and playing fields were greatly superior to those provided to women. For some sports, there were no locker rooms for women. Women would just dress in the dormitory, in their dormitory rooms. In a number of schools, women reporters from either school papers or national papers or local papers were not allowed in the press box for athletic events. They simply weren't, it just was not their place to be. Nor were they allowed in men's locker rooms to interview players. It became very clear that the impact of Title IX in athletics was going to be very big, and made a huge, the Title IX made a huge difference in athletics. It's been the most visible. What has it accomplished? Increased awareness by women and everybody else about sex discrimination, about policies and so forth. Most people had little idea about sex discrimination. Now awareness increased. And as a result of the increased awareness, women become a new advocacy group, and they band together in various ways, and they began to organize for change. Sometimes this was dangerous. Many women were fired. I knew of women who, assistant professors who had no tenure, who went on welfare, and so forth. But some of them also went to law school and became sex discrimination attorneys, so for some of them at least it worked out. Most, not all, but most of the overt policies and practices that excluded girls and women or treated them differently were abolished. That is a huge change. The number of women in undergraduate programs accelerated. Thousands of women faculty members received so-called equity raises, but as far as I know, none received back pay or back benefits for the years that they were underpaid. The raises were sometimes quite big. I knew of one woman who got a $20,000 raise in about 1975 or so, when $20,000 was a lot more than this. Not only major changes, lots of minor ones. The University of Maryland used to have maid service in men's dormitories, but not in women's dormitories. Fun to laugh at that, but it also meant women had to spend time cleaning their rooms, and men had more time for studying or more other things that they wanted to do. It meant the career days in high school for high school boys, while high school girls had a fashion show at the same time, or requiring women to live on campus, which is more expensive, and men could live off campus, and so forth. Most of the changes occurred not just because there was a law or because somebody filed a lawsuit. Most of the changes occurred because women, parents, a group of students began to recognize a particular policy or practice was illegal, and so they made the people with decision-making power aware of Title IX. The school attorney would be called. The attorney would say, what is this Title IX thing? I never heard of it. They'd say, please look it up and get back to us. And then about a week or two later, there'd be an announcement that it's time to get rid of this single-sex policy that doesn't allow women to do X or Y. Title IX also increased the confidence and self-esteem of women. Discrimination takes a terrible toll on people who experience it. Young girls today want to be lawyers, doctors, accountants, professors, astronauts, police officers, firefighters, and so forth. All occupations are considered unfeminine. Not much in the crafts, like plumbers, however, and electricians. There's been very little progress in that area for women. Women's issues have been institutionalized, Commission on Women at this institution, women's centers, and so forth and so on. Even the catalogs say that they can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And many of you know the Chronicle of Higher Education and the ads they have for positions in academia. That comes about because of Title IX, because of the way you used to hire is you call, one guy calls another guy and says, do you know a good guy for this guy? And he says, for this job. And then the other guy says, oh, yes, I have a graduate student who's getting his doctorate now, or my good friend Jim Smith, and that's how jobs were learned about. And now that's the only way you recruit, that's not a good idea. The awareness and interest, research and data about women and discrimination is now legitimate knowledge that was virtually absent before Title IX. When I was getting my doctorate in the 1960s, I thought it would be interesting to do my thesis on how young women made vocational decisions. This is before the women's movement and before I'm interested, but I just thought it would be interesting, and I told this to my advisor, and he looks at me like I'm crazy. He's absolutely stunned. He's shocked at my suggestion for my thesis, and he says, verbatim, research on women, that's not real research. Find another topic. That would not happen today, again, because of Title IX. The awareness and interest in diverse groups of women has become not only a legitimate area of concern, but one which is an important area on its own. Even the hearings on Title IX included some of the problems of women of color, and attention to diverse groups of women has grown to include not only women of color, but poor girls as a group, poor women, disabled women and girls, lesbian women and girls, immigrant women and girls, and others. So we're looking at different diverse groups of this. Women's participation and interest in sports has skyrocketed. But now let me tell you what we still need to do, and then I'll finish. Lower education, K through 12. Most of the progress has been made in higher education, much less in lower education. We just don't see as much there, whether it's in sports or vocational education and so forth. Enforcement of Title IX by the Office for Civil Rights is very spotty. They're underfunded. They're typically delayed and backlogged, and it would be nice if we could get a bigger budget, but I don't think that's going to happen. Sports, enormous progress, tremendous progress. We have actually gone from absolutely horrid to just very bad. Most colleges are out of compliance with Title IX, and so are many of the elementary and secondary ones. We need, one of the major issues, two major, employment of women in academia and elsewhere, not limited to them, has improved enormously, but the pattern of discrimination is the same everywhere. The higher the rank, the fewer the women. The more prestigious the school, the fewer the women. The more prestigious the department, the fewer the women. And that pattern has not changed very much at all. Maybe it's risen a little bit. The glass ceiling's gone up and women have risen a little bit, but the pattern is still the same. A major issue is sexual harassment. The extreme version of sexual harassment is sexual assault. Let me give you a figure. 1 out of every 4 or 5 women attending college, and next time you see a group of women, you can think about this statistic. 1 out of every 4 or 5 women who attend college will experience either attempted rape or actual sexual assault. That is a stunning figure. It's better than the rest of the world, where 1 in 3 women will experience sexual assault, but it is still much too high, and we need to do much. My own theory is, not mine, other people have told me this, and I think they're right, is that when women drop out of college, that's often the reason they don't report it and they don't tell you. When Title IX was passed, I thought it would take 1 year, and everything would be changed, and of course it's taking a little longer. I will just want to tell you a story, and then I'm finished. Last year was the 40th anniversary of Title IX, and there were celebrations and articles in the newspaper, and ESPN did stuff and whatnot. And so I got a lot of calls from reporters, and I got one call from one reporter who asked me a question I had never been asked before. He said, "Do you have grandchildren?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, how has Title IX affected them?" I have 2 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, and I wished I had been able, I'm thinking, I can't say that Jessica's great in sports, because Jessica was the child who played 3 soccer games and then told her parents that she wanted to quit because she didn't care what happened to a ball. And so I could not say that my granddaughter, was a tremendous athlete and whatnot. And then I thought for a minute, and I recognized what I had seen all along but not noticed, is that all 3 of my grandchildren, from early childhood on, have had a friend of the other gender, literally. A friend with whom they were not romantically or sexually engaged. And so that, when good things or bad things would happen, I'd hear, well, I want to call Amanda and ask, tell her about this, or I want to call Jim, so forth. And I think that's, in the long run, that's what Title IX is all about. It would have been impossible or very difficult when I grew up to have friends who were of the other gender. You hardly ever talked to boys once you reached dating age, and when you did, the boys didn't talk very much anyway, so you didn't have many conversations with boys unless you grew up with brothers or a boy neighbor. But I think being friends, for men and women to be friends, is really the impact in many ways of Title IX. That is an impact, and coupled with the women's movement, that is worldwide. And we are engaged in this, and the impact of laws like Title IX and the women's movement in general, because you can't really separate them, is enormous. It is a worldwide movement. And it will have an impact like the Industrial Revolution, which is, I mean, enormous when you think of this. Helping men and women have respect for each other and to be friends. That's going to take a long time. And we have just only begun the very first steps of this very, very long journey. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandler. We do have a few questions. Does anyone have anything written that I could grab and say out loud, or would anyone like to raise their hand? I'll walk up so Dr. Sandler could hear.
Dr. Sandler, thank you very much for such an interesting lecture.
Could you speak a little louder or closer
I'm
to the mic?
sorry.
Thank you.
Can you hear me better now?
That's a little better, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Just thank you for a most interesting lecture. I did have a question. It's asking for some advice. What I've noticed is a lot of women my generation have taken the whole movement and all of the work that your generation has done to bring us to this point where I can sit here and I have a doctorate and I can be, you know, among my male peers and toe-to-toe. And the word feminism and women's movement, I was trying to recruit the word feminism and women's movement, and I was trying to recruit some of my colleagues to come with me tonight, and they were like, oh, well, you know, we're not really into that. And it's like the whole concept of advocating for our rights and our well-being is played down so much, and I'm actually seeing not my male colleagues are extremely supportive, but I'm finding female colleagues are actually highly competitive and they put you down, and I'm not quite understanding how we can address that, because it seems like my generation of women are...
and how to address it. Part of what's happened is because we've made progress, we've lost the horror stories. And the horror stories are very useful to recruit people and to get them to understand women's issues. But now we have lost it because nobody comes out and says, we don't hire women here. Or, you know, you're really qualified, but we don't, you know, you're female, and so just don't think about working here. You don't get that. And many young women think that we have solved all the problems, that there is equal opportunity. What they don't realize is college is the last bastion. This is the best it is for women and men together. This is the last bastion of equality in their life. Because when they leave college, it's not a merit-based, you know, college to a large degree is merit-based for students. You know, you get grades. And most of the time they're probably fair, occasionally not, but you're graded on your work. And there's not that much overt sex discrimination, putting sexual harassment and assault on the side. And so they think all the problems have been solved, and they don't know it. Now, what happens after they finish college, they start at almost the same starting salaries. And this has been interesting to watch over the year, because it used to be like this when they started. It's now very close. And then what happens is the males begin to get more promotions and more salaries, and the women are going up more slowly. And by the time they're in their 30s, the men are making substantially more money than most of the women who were in their cohorts. And the women don't see this until it's maybe too late, or they don't ever see it. But we've lost a lot of the horror stories, and that's, you know, a really good tool. I think you know, how do you increase the discontent of women? And that's hard to do. Now, what women, particularly younger women, are concerned about the body issues. They're concerned about sexual harassment and sexual assault. And those are the issues we have to work with them on, because that's where they are. I don't know what the answer is to this. I also want to remind you that the women's movement was really quite small in terms of the people who were not just the supporters, but the people doing the actual work. It wasn't a lot of people. I mean, I didn't do it by myself. I had a lot of help and so forth, but we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people doing this. We're talking about small numbers. We gave the impression of lots of numbers, and I think we did. A lot of people were supportive. And I think generally the women that we're talking about are supportive, but not actively. And they think the problems are solved. So I don't have an answer for this. A lot of us struggle with it, and I think we probably have to do more about. I think they're interested in the body issues because that's where they have the least power. And that is something, I think that's involved in their being concerned with this. They think they have the power in getting a job. And they will get jobs, but they're just not going to be as good as the men's jobs or be paid as much. I mean, I'm not satisfied with the answer because I don't know what the real answer is. You know, if there is a real answer, I just don't know. But it's a good question. Thank you.
Kind of along those same lines, and I know you don't have an answer, but I think one of the things I've been thinking about lately is the ERA and how it came so close to passing, and then thanks to Phyllis Schlafly and some other fine people, it totally tanked in the end, and they just missed it. And I often wonder if the impact of her and the fact that the ERA lost in the early 80s, if that just kind of flat out stopped everything, and so everyone just thought, well, we made it this far, so why keep going? We can pretty much do everything anyway.
Well, I think one of the things that happened, this is the Equal Rights Amendment, because there are some people like Supreme Court Justice Scalia who believes the 14th Amendment, which was originally enacted in terms of African Americans, he believes he's an originalist, and although the Supreme Court itself has said now that the 14th Amendment covers women, he doesn't believe that it does. And we really do need an amendment to the Constitution, which, you know, the original Constitution did not consider women equal at all. They couldn't vote and so forth. He believes it doesn't apply, and we need to be sure that it does. And it would do certain things. I testified on the Equal Rights Amendment when it was going through the Congress. We lost it for a number of reasons. We lost it because we thought some of us were naive enough to think everyone's going to vote for this. And the first, you know, Hawaii voted immediately and other states did, but there were some states where there was opposition. We were not organized on the state level at all. And I think that made a difference. There was a lot of opposition, I think, from the insurance industry, because a lot of insurance is sex-oriented. You pay more for insurance if you're a male. For driver's insurance, women, some places, women used to get lower pensions because of they lived longer, so their pensions would be small, and that's taken care of by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. In the new Health Care Act, before that, women sometimes were paying twice as much as men for insurance because they can have babies, and it didn't matter whether you had your babies or never. We're planning on having, you were all charged in that particular policies. Women were charged sometimes twice as much as similarly situated men. That will not happen under the new Affordable Care Act. But we do need the Equal Rights Amendment. It was limited to 7 years to get it. Some people have said that that doesn't count, and there is a group in Washington that believes if we can get 2 more states to vote for it, that maybe we would get it. The Supreme Court would probably get that case eventually, and who knows what they would do. We do need it. There is not the impetus now, because a lot of the inequities at the state level have been corrected, not all. But there used to be horrible inequities at the state law involving marriage, involving property, ownership of property. And for a number of reasons, many states literally examined, as did the federal government, examined the laws on their books and looked at what needed to be amended, whether it needed to say men and women rather than just men are covered. And then you have the thing, did it mean just men, or does men or man mean men and women? So we have a long way to go on that, and it is needed. And I don't know if we have the resources to do it, or what would happen if 2 more states did. But it is important. The Constitution is far more powerful than any law. And it would tell Justice Scalia that we are entitled to equal protection under the law. He doesn't believe that. He said that publicly about a year or 2 ago.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. What advice would you have for young women who are just starting to get involved in the feminist?
Getting involved in it is to find an organization that works on the issues she likes. It could be an association of women physicians. It could be a group that works on sexual assault, if that's what it is. But if you work on what you're interested in, you tend to work a lot harder than just something more generic. And there are lots of groups out there that she could find a way to help and be a part of. but she should figure out what group interests her the most and then run with the ball. And we do have groups and people like that. We just don't, you never have enough as such.
Actually, Dr. Sandler, I have a question. Would you be able to comment at all about the 2011 Dear Colleague letter around Title IX?
Yeah, yeah.
And do you anticipate there being any future Dear Colleague letters around different aspects of Title IX? And if so, what do you think that next area is going to be?
Let me tell people what the Dear Colleague letter is. A Dear Colleague letter is a letter that goes out to, in the Department of Education, it goes out to presidents and or superintendents of schools. Actually, the first one, and I only realized this recently, the first one that went out, I suggested, we were a group meeting with the Department of Education quite regularly. I think it was still HEW maybe at that point. And the Title IX regulation was being issued. And I said, and this, actually, they thought we were so powerful. The Secretary of the Department was meeting with us. No one knew, we weren't that powerful, but we looked at. And I suggested to Secretary Weinberger, why don't you send out the regulation to every president and superintendent? And he liked that idea and send out what is now called a Dear Colleague letter, a DCL, which goes to presidents and whatnot. Okay, periodically, the Office for Civil Rights, after months, sometimes a year or two of discussion, sends out a letter about a particular issue. For a long time, and actually the Supreme Court said that Title IX covers sexual harassment because we didn't have a word for it when it was passed. So it became an issue, is this really discrimination? And the Supreme Court, and I believe it was unanimous, said, yeah, it covers sexual harassment. We know the extreme form of sexual harassment is assault. The Dear Colleague letter, which for reasons I don't fully understand, it says it applies to K through 12, but the letter is only going to superintendents. That tells me it's a political issue, something, but I don't know anything about it. But in any event, what the Dear Colleague letter does, it reminds people, it's not a change in policy, but it reminds colleges and universities that they have a responsibility concerning sexual assault and that they need to prevent it and respond appropriately to it and take care of it. This is not new policy. This has been policy for many, many years. But many schools, and I think colleges, and K through 12 too, particularly high schools, are not much better. From if you would know the Steubenville case, that's not been handled so well, high school. But it scared universities because many of them have not been doing anything in that. And under Title IX, any person who feels discriminated could go into court anytime they want. They don't need the permission of the school. They don't even have to notify them that that's what they're doing until the suit is filed. And they have that right. And some of the lawsuits have been expensive. We're talking six-figure settlements or the court ordering that amount of money to be paid. And so schools are quite worried about this issue because publicly it's terrible publicity. Some of you have followed Notre Dame, and I'm mentioning Notre Dame because it comes to mind, but it's not that it's the worst example. It's a typical example of a young woman who was sexually assaulted. It reported it was treated not well, and eventually she killed herself. She's not the only one that has happened to. So the Dear Colleague letter has sparked a new interest in what is it we do about sexual assault. And you heard the figure before, 1 out of every 4 to 5 students. I mean, that's a horrible figure if you think of it. Next time you see the women, just divide it into 5 or 4ths and say, that's how many. So it's having a big impact. There are all kinds of conferences now and training programs and helping schools deal with this. Many of schools have dealt with it extremely badly, and I end up getting calls from some of these women, and I will just tell you one story. This woman was raped at a party. She probably had a little bit too much to drink, but she was definitely raped. She filed a charge the next morning. She went on the web, found the policy, and filed a charge. By the end of the day, the policy was removed, and she could not get a hold of it. They would not give her the policy. And whatever happened to her subsequently was along that line. She eventually, followed through and sued. And I don't know what happened with the case, but she is becoming a lawyer as a result of that. She got very interested in policies and how they work and so forth. But schools have not been doing very much, and they now have to do something, and they're not sure. Many schools do not even have a policy, but even when they do, it's not followed. At Montana, this is less than 4 or 5 weeks ago in the New York Times, a young woman accuses another young man of sexual assault, and one of the staff members, and I don't know what his position was, but his name was in the New York Times, he was scouring the code of conduct in that school to see what he could charge the woman with. Raped. And now he wants to embarrass her and say she did the wrong thing. And the horror stories are just enormous, and this is why schools are upset. So I don't know if it fully answers your question, but we will see, I think, a lot of movement in the next couple of years on sexual assault. The stories that I have heard are really very bad because schools are not sure what to do. They worry about the publicity. And what I think schools ought to do is what one school did about maybe 20 years ago, and I don't think if they follow through again, I just don't have any information. They sent out to parents of students who've been accepted, they sent out a letter and they said, sexual assault is a national problem in our colleges in the United States. This is what our college is doing. And then they talked about their prevention program. Now, and then they had some questions, and they said, here are questions that you might want to discuss with your son or your daughter. I think, that's a brilliant thing to do, and, in getting parents to be glad that their daughter's going to that college, or their son, because it's very bad for young men who get involved in this. I mean, we need to do things at all levels of this problem, from prevention and letting people know about it and continual training programs and so forth. It's a huge problem, and this is what this Dear Colleague letter is all about. It reminds colleges they have a responsibility and they can't ignore this anymore. So I think in the next 5 years we're really going to see some good movement on this issue.
Dr. Sandler, we have time for maybe one more question. Does anyone have another question?
Someone over here.
All right.
Okay, women have gotten a lot more opportunities in athletics now, but society still puts a lot more prominence on men's sports. Society still puts more prominence on men's athletics, even though women have more opportunities now. What progress do you think still needs to be made, or to have women's sports seen as more prevalent and important?
Probably almost every college is out of compliance in some part of Title IX, and it's athletic stuff. To give you one figure, just in high schools, to show how little progress we've made, even though the number of women high school athletes has increased by about 900% since Title IX. But the number of women high school athletes today participating is less than the number of men who were male athletes who were participating in high school athletics when Title IX was passed. So here's the number of men in 1972 who were participating, and the number of women now participating in high school sports is down here. This is 40 years later. I think we need to do more. I think one of the things that happens that I am appalled with, and I've just begun to realize this and I'm figuring out what to do next, is schools of education which teaches and coaches people who are going to be professionals in athletics. They get one course that's, if they're going to be an administrator, they may get one course which talks about the law and affecting higher education, which means maybe one session, maybe less than one session would be devoted to Title IX. But a lot of coaches never heard of Title IX these days. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. Even if they've heard of it, they may not know what's required of them, because the things they do sometimes are clear violations of Title IX, and they don't always understand it or know about it. I mean, sometimes I talk with coaches and stuff, and I'm astonished that they've never had any training on Title IX. The same is true, incidentally, of K through 12 teachers. They get practically none, any legal stuff, although on Americans with Disabilities, they may get some of that because they deal with that more directly. But last spring, a school in Texas paid for buses to send boys, not girls, boys, to see a film on African-American pilots in World War II. They spent over $70,000 on buses. I mean, I don't know why they never heard of Netflix whatever. But I mean, that's a lot of money for a small school district to spend, and the girls got to see a film staying in their classrooms. And I'm appalled because no administrator in that school district understood that this was a violation of law. I mean, this is clearly a violation, and people just don't understand it. So we've got to start at a number of levels, and people have to send information to the Office for Civil Rights that this is happening. You know, our school just got rid of several women's teams because, you know, we just don't have enough money, kinds of things. Some of the things are easier to fight. The light of publicity is sometimes very helpful. A lot of schools blame when they shut down some sports, and it includes men's sports and or women's sports, they blame it on Title IX when it turns out to be a budget decision. That they've decided they can save money by, if you eliminate these men's sports and you can increase the football people more, football's the elephant in the room because you have like 100 spots or more. And then that means you've got to find at least that amount for women of athletics. It's a very difficult issue because you have to have some segregation. And I don't have the answer. But I think people have to know the law, the regulation, and how it affects athletics, and to point out these things. It may be that you get the school newspaper to do a study of compliance with Title IX. It may be that students set up their own committee, or that women do it. It may be that you work with the university very directly in terms of these issues. There are all kinds of strategies to get people aware of what's happening on their campus. And indeed, nothing happens unless somebody does something about it. People will just go continuing what they want to do or what they are doing until they feel uncomfortable. And making people uncomfortable. I said this morning when I was talking to a group. If you're lying in bed and you're comfortable, you don't turn over. You don't do anything different. You just lie there very comfortably. When you feel uncomfortable, you'll turn over. And I think this is true of social change. That's one of the ways of starting social change is the discontent. And if you could increase that discontent, and maybe that's the strategy with young women, we have to get them more information about what they need to be upset about. Then you get people beginning to move. So it's a social change, and it's not easy, but it is indeed possible, particularly in a country like the United States, which is not a repressive, country. And there is the possibility of real change. And I think Title IX is a democratizing kind of thing. It makes people think of equality and so forth. And I don't have a direct answer as such. But we've made enormous progress. It's just that the road ahead is still much longer than any of us anticipated, partly because we had no idea there was so much discrimination. So I hope that some of you will take some of that away with you. So thank you very much. These are really good questions. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.